There is a wall in Rome, and on the evening of the 28th of March, in the year 193, two men are standing on opposite sides of it, shouting numbers at each other. The wall belongs to the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, the Castra Praetoria, a great brick rectangle on the high ground northeast of the city. Inside it stand the only soldiers Rome allows within its sacred boundary. A few hours earlier, these men cut the head from their own emperor and carried it through their camp on the point of a spear. Now they are leaning over their own rampart, looking down at the candidates gathered below, and they are taking bids. Because that is what is happening. The throne of the Roman world is for sale, and the auction is being run over a fortification wall by the men who are supposed to defend the man who sits on it. One bidder is a former consul named Sulpicianus, who has the bad fortune to be standing inside the camp, where the soldiers can watch his face. The other is a senator named Marcus Didius Julianus, who is shut out and forced to call his offer up from the street below, holding his fingers in the air to show the figure when the noise drowns him out. They go back and forth. The price climbs. It stops when one of them names a sum no Roman had ever attached to a single man's loyalty. 25,000 sesterces. To every soldier, every one of the roughly 10,000 men of the guard. 25,000 sesterces a head. Enough, by the going rate, to keep a legionary in pay for nearly a decade. Promised in a single night to an entire corps by a man who did not have it. This is the story of how the Roman Empire was sold at a wall to a man who could not pay for it, and bought back 8 weeks later by a man who never bid at all. It is the story of a year Romans would spend the rest of their history trying not to look at directly. And it turns, from first sentence to last, on a simple and ruinous idea. That the empire was a thing one could purchase, like a house in the hills or a fish pond stocked with mullet, if only the price were high enough. Cassius Dio was there, not at the wall perhaps, but in the city, a young senator who would later write the history of these months from inside the room, and his contempt has not cooled in 18 centuries. He calls it what it was. The empire, he writes, was put up for sale as if at a public auction, and the Romans and their entire dominion were knocked down to the highest bidder. Dio is the closest thing we have to a witness, and I trust him more than I trust the others, for a reason I will come to. But even Dio cannot quite believe what he is recording. You feel him, across all those centuries, setting down his stylus and shaking his head. If the way Rome actually worked is the kind of thing that keeps you here, not the marble and the slogans, but the machinery underneath, the men with the spears who decided who lived in the palace, then stay. There is a great deal of it on this channel, and this is one of the worst nights in all of it. So, we have our auction. We have our buyer, Julianus, standing in the street with his fingers raised. But to understand how a Roman could come to believe that the throne was a lot to be knocked down at the camp wall, you have to go back a few hours, to the murder that emptied it, and then back further still, to the short, doomed reign of the man whose head was riding through the Praetorian camp on a spear while the bidding began. On the morning of that same day, a few hundred soldiers walked out of the Castra Praetoria with their swords drawn and went to the palace to kill the emperor. His name was Pertinax. He had worn the purple for 87 days. He was the son of a freed slave, a former schoolmaster who had risen through the army to the top of the Roman world, and on the first day of January, after the assassination of the monster Commodus, the Senate and the Guard had hailed him with relief. The relief did not last. Pertinax tried to do the one thing a Roman emperor in 193 could not do and survive. He tried to impose discipline on the men who had put him there. He had promised the Praetorians a donative, a cash gift, the customary bribe a new emperor paid the guard for the privilege of being protected by them, of 12,000 sesterces a man. Whether he paid it in full is one of those points where the sources quietly part ways. Dio implies the money was found. The later biographers say only half ever reached the men. The treasury Commodus left behind was a ruin either way. What is not in dispute is that Pertinax began trimming the extravagances of the court, selling off Commodus's boys and horses and gilded furniture at auction to raise money. To a corps of soldiers who had spent the reign of Commodus doing more or less as they pleased, an emperor who counted coins and expected them to drill was not a relief at all. He was a threat. When the soldiers came for him, Pertinax did not run. Cassius Dio, who knew him, says he went out to meet them and tried to talk them down, and that for a moment it nearly worked. Some of them lowered their eyes. Then a man stepped forward and struck. They cut him down in his own palace, took his head, fixed it on a spear, and carried it back to the camp. He had reigned, by Dio's count, 87 days. The accountant emperor who tried to make Rome solvent again was dead by lunchtime, and the men who killed him went back behind their wall and waited to see what they would be offered for the empty throne. What they were offered was the auction. Now you should know that our witnesses do not entirely agree on what happened at that wall, and the difference matters. Cassius Dio, the senator, the man in the city, describes a bidding. Sulpicianus inside the camp, Julianus shut out and calling up his offer, but he keeps it relatively restrained. Herodian, writing somewhat later, and with a dramatist's hand, gives us the full theatre. The soldiers leaning over the rampart like men at a market stall, the bids shouted back and forth, the figure raised by hand signal. And the Historia Augusta, that strange late collection of imperial biographies written more than a century afterward and never to be trusted on its own, embroiders the whole thing further still. I lean toward Dio, and not only because he was there. Herodian loves a scene a little too much. You can feel him improving the story. Something close to an auction happened. Whether the soldiers literally cried prices over the wall, the way Herodian stages it, I would not bet a single sesterce on. The truth, I think, sits a little below his theatre and a little above Dio's restraint. But on the central fact, all three agree, and it is the fact that damns the year. The guard sold the throne, and the winning bid came from Julianus. Who was he? A wealthy senator of long standing, a former consul, a man who had governed provinces and commanded troops and held just about every honor the cursus offered. He was, by every account, rich, vain, and not nearly as clever as he believed. The story the sources tell, and here even Dio repeats it, so it was at least the gossip of the city, is that Julianus was at dinner when the news of Pertinax's death reached him, and that his wife and daughter and a crowd of flatterers urged him from the table and hurried him to the camp to put in a bid before someone else did. He went to seize the Roman Empire the way a man might be talked into buying a villa he had not meant to buy that afternoon. He raised the price to 25,000 a man. The gates opened. They proclaimed him emperor, draped the imperial cloak on him, and brought him to the Senate under the protection of the very swords that had killed the last man to wear it. Remember that protection. It was the only thing he had actually bought. Far from Rome, on the edges of the empire, Other men were hearing the same news, and they were not reaching for their purses. They were reaching for their legions. The frontier armies, the real army, the hundreds of thousands of men holding the Rhine and the Danube and the Euphrates, had not been consulted. In Syria, the governor Pescennius Niger was popular with his troops and would soon let them hail him. In Britain, Clodius Albinus commanded 3 legions and his own ambitions.
And in Pannonia,
On the upper Danube, the closest of the great army commands to Italy itself, sat a hard, patient, African-born senator named Lucius Septimius Severus, legate of Pannonia Superior, with the largest concentration of legions in the west within marching distance of Rome. He had not bid. He had no intention of bidding. While Julianus was being measured for the purple, Severus was reading a map. To understand what happened to the man who bought the empire, you have to follow the man who simply came to take it, and the speed at which he moved. For the first few days, Marcus Didius Julianus was an emperor. He moved into the palace where Pertinax had bled out a week before. He gave the orders an emperor gives. He minted coins with his own face on them and his daughter's, and he tried to settle into the role he had bought as though the buying were the hard part and the rest would follow. It is a quiet, almost domestic picture, and the sources let it sit for a moment before they break it. Because outside the palace, the city had already turned on him. The people of Rome, who had not been paid to love him, lined the streets and the circus and shouted insults at their new emperor to his face. They called him a thief. They called for Niger, the governor in Syria, to come and save them. And Julianus, who had imagined that the cloak came with the affection, discovered that he had purchased a corpse's clothes and an empty room. Then the real news arrived. In Pannonia, the legions had hailed Septimius Severus emperor. On the 9th of April, by the reckoning most historians accept, less than 2 weeks after the auction, and Severus had not paused to celebrate it. He had taken the name of the murdered Pertinax as his own, declaring himself the avenger of the man the guard had killed, and he was already moving down the great roads toward Italy with his army, faster than any Roman could quite believe. This is the thing about Severus that the chroniclers keep returning to: the speed. He understood, as Julianus never did, that in a civil war the empire belongs to whoever reaches Rome first, and he reached for it the way a man reaches for a falling cup. What followed in the capital was the unraveling of a man who had nothing to fight back with except money, and was learning that money was the one thing this fight would not take. Julianus tried everything. He sent assassins north to kill Severus. They failed or never tried. He had the Senate declare Severus a public enemy. The declaration meant nothing to a man with 16 legions. He attempted to have a successor or a co-emperor named to dilute the threat, and changed his mind, and tried something else. And in the detail that says more about the year than any battle could, he set the Praetorian Guard, his guard, the 10,000 men whose loyalty he had bought for 25,000 sesterces apiece, to fortifying the city and preparing for war. They were not infantry. They were a garrison gone soft on bribes and city duty, and Dio describes them almost pityingly, drilling and digging and trying to remember how to be soldiers, training elephants to carry towers and failing even at that, while a real field army came down the roads to meet them. The donative, by the way, had never been paid in full. Julianus could not find the money. The men who had sold him the throne had not even been given the price. It is worth pausing here because this is the hinge of the whole disaster, and it is quieter than the auction that opened it. If the slow machinery of how power actually changed hands in Rome is what holds you, the bargains, the broken promises, the moment a bought army remembers it was never really bought, then this is the channel that follows it, chronicle by chronicle. There is more of this waiting. Back to Rome and the last days of the man who paid for the throne. The guard did the arithmetic before Julianus did. As Severus drew near, he sent them a message. He had no quarrel with them as a body, only with the actual murderers of Pertinax, and any man who handed those over and laid down his arms had nothing to fear. It was an offer of survival, and it cost the guard nothing but a man who had already failed to pay them. They took it. They arrested the soldiers who had struck down Pertinax, and they abandoned Julianus exactly